All right, we are recording.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Jeremy Garber. I'm chair of the Lifelong Learning Committee. And this program is also sponsored by the Pride Committee. And I've asked Jordan Aronson whether he had a specific question from the Pride Committee. But let me begin. As a struggling reader of the Vorwärts, the Yiddish newspaper, I came across an article 5 or 6 years ago that really grabbed my attention. It was about a young Hasidic rabbi who had transitioned into becoming a young, non-Orthodox Jewish woman. I found the article fascinating, but none of the names registered, just the story. Last year, after ordering a Jewish book on Amazon, its algorithm recommended to me the memoir, Becoming Eve, My Journey from Ultra-Orthodox Rabbi to Transgender Woman. And I put 2 and 2 together and realized it was written by the subject of the Vorwärts article, Chava Stein. I ordered the book, I read it swiftly, and I was both fascinated and moved by the story. So poignant, so contemporary, and yet echoing the autobiographies of questioning Jews who left Orthodoxy as far back as Solomon Maimon of 1770s Poland. I then looked up Abby Stein on YouTube and found that she had been interviewed by many major media outlets in the US and throughout the world, including the New York Times. She was on the Today Show, CNN, and more. She had spoken at the 92nd Street Y and at numerous other cultural centers and universities. I learned that Abby was born in Brooklyn into a prominent Yiddish-speaking Hasidic family, direct descendants of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. She was a precocious student of Talmud and Hasidic texts, but as an adolescent, began to question her religious beliefs. But even earlier, she was questioning, almost from birth, why she, experiencing life internally as a girl, was being treated as a boy. Abby's yeshiva studies culminated in her smicha, her ordination as a rabbi, but thereafter she left her community to pursue secular studies at Columbia University, and now at age 29 is a noted author, educator, and activist on both transgender and Jewish issues. I asked various people at Shul if they had ever heard of Abby Stein and her memoir, including Tali Schwartzer, who told me, Abby Stein, not only have I heard of her, I know her well. I worked with her. She taught at Oheb Zieben School 5 or 6 years ago. I was astonished. This was confirmed by Rabbi Cooper, Linda Griffler, and several others. So we are delighted and honored to have Rabbi Abby Chava Stein return to Oheb, if only virtually, share her unique journey and be our rabbi and teacher this morning. Abby.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I want to add to that. I wasn't sure you were going to mention it, but yes, I did. I did indeed teach for 1 year at Oheb Shalom. I also worked the summer before. I worked at Raman Nayak, so got to know Amy, obviously, and I guess that was my first introduction to Oheb Shalom. But also the first speech I gave after I came out, literally that weekend, that Friday night, that Shabbat, was at Oheb Shalom. I had at the time, I don't know how many of you remember, Jamie Middleman, who was a friend of mine that I knew from before through the Ma, and we had like this event scheduled, and then I came out, and it was like, and it just happened. It was like the same weekend. I don't even know if I knew what I was doing at the time, but just wanted to say this. So it's really good to come back to Oheb Shalom and do this event. Before I get started, I have 2, let's call them brief housekeeping stuff. The first one is I would love to see as many of your faces as possibly. Obviously, I'm not telling any of you what to do. Everyone who knows me knows that I'm bad at listening to other people telling me what to do, so I'm not going to try telling anyone what to do. But if you feel comfortable turning your video on, I would love to see your face. I think we're all at this point where we are pandemic fatigue and Zoom fatigue. So here's my proposal. We don't care how you're dressed. Well, if you're dressed really nice, maybe we'll do care. But we don't care what you're wearing. I sometimes say, or lag thereof, as long as you're decent. It's a Sunday. You're all allowed to wear whatever, it's your PJs or something really nice. We don't care. Feel free and feel comfortable to put your video up. The second thing I want to say, I'm going to take some questions towards the end. So as I go through the event, I will do some readings of the book. I will share some videos through my screen. If there's any questions that come up, I encourage you to leave that towards the end, and we'll take questions at the end. However, if I say something and you don't know what that means, I usually like to use an example. I say Shabbat, and you're like, what is Shabbat? I get a feeling you all might know that, but just a hypothetical example. I do encourage you to stop me on the spot. I might not be paying that much attention, so I encourage all the people here who are running the show, so to speak, Jeremy or Justin, to stop me at any point if there's a clarifying question. Someone doesn't understand a term that I said, and so on. And then actual questions will leave to the end. Now, I want to start by a small reading of this book. I'm going to do, I think, well, 2 or 3 readings of the book, but I want to start with one specifically from the epilogue. So if any of you, like Jeremy, have read this book, then you might know that the book kind of ends, according to some people, abruptly. I just saw it as a cliffhanger in 2012. And that is not by mistake. It is intentional. The book is about coming of age as opposed to telling all the stories I have to tell. I chose to focus a lot about my childhood as opposed to give a bit about the childhood and then a bit about adulthood. So this is about childhood, so to speak. But then there's the epilogue. So the epilogue jumps ahead by about 3 years and tells mostly the story of me coming out to my dad and then coming out to my friends. I will talk in a minute a bit more about the Hasidic community I was raised in, so you will have even a better sense of who my dad is and the background he's coming to this with. But just a bit, my dad is not just Hasidic. He is a Hasidic rabbi. He is in many ways, well, if not him directly, though he also does it, at least people in my family and so on, very much set a tone in certain Hasidic communities. Just like me, I didn't know the word transgender, not hate it, wasn't transfer. I didn't even know it exists. I've never heard that word until I was 20, which is in 2012 when I got online for the first time. My dad has never heard of that word until 2015 when I came out to him. I was the first person who has been raised in a Hasidic community ever. Hasidic community is 250 years old with hundreds of thousands of people. There was no one who ever came out as trans up to the point that I came out. There has been several people after that. So really wasn't something that he was aware of. So this is the context of what I want to read. I am talking to him. I'm trying to come out to him. And before we could even get to the point, are you going to accept me or not? There's simply me trying to explain to him who I am and what I'm trying to tell him. Finally, I could see that Tati, so Tati is how we called my dad in Yiddish. I could see that Tati was beginning to grasp what we were talking about. He still seemed confused, but now his expression seemed to shift into a glimpse of understanding. Impatient, I finally uttered the words I was so desperate for him to hear. Tati, I said, looking him in the eye. Tati, I am a girl. I am a girl. I'd said it. Tati's eyes flew to the table, avoiding me, fumbling for words. For a moment, there was only silence. Then he spoke. But, he stammered, I don't get it. Men have a higher place in society. Men have better roles in the world. Why would you do that? More silence. Fine, I thought. Tati doesn't believe that it is possible. He's going to say that being transgender is impossible, that trans people don't exist, and he will brush us off. After all, I had heard far less religious people say such things. I couldn't expect Tati to be any different. This time, however, Tati surprised me. Okay, yes, he said, it is possible that there are people in the world whose bodies and souls are different, and it can be real. But you need a tzaddik, a righteous person who has a Holy Spirit within him, to know that for sure. He seemed very sure of his assertion. Well, I've seen 2 therapists and a doctor who all agree with me that I am a girl, I told him. They're not tzaddikim, holy people, but they know it's true. But do you think that is okay with Judaism? He lamented. That's as many spoilers as I would give from that part of the book. And obviously, I hope for those of you who haven't read it yet, I do encourage you. Here's my shameless self-promotion. You can buy it in a hardcover or an ebook or listen to it, an audiobook. But I wanted to focus on that for a second. And I have to say, it never gets old to me. I realized that the first time as I was reading from the book after the book came out a bit more than a year ago. And I was, if I remember correctly, it was the Jewish Book Festival in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was sitting in a room, it was one of the biggest book events. We had like 500 people being there in person. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, you know what? I think I have a better response. You can read in the book to see what the we I'm talking about is a rabbi, Rabbi David Ingber. We'll talk more a bit about him later. I came out to my dad at his apartment, and myself, we were coming out to my dad. But you can read what we told him. But I was sitting in that room, and ever since, I have had the privilege to give hundreds of talks since the book came out. I've done over 200 virtual talks since COVID started. And many of them, I would say the vast majority even, have been with Jewish communities. And specifically that moment, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I have a better answer to my, let's call them my daddy issues, so to speak. Sitting in a room filled with Jewish people, hosted by a Jewish community, that specific event was at the JCC, but ever since, and it never gets old. Every time I walk into a room, physically or virtually, hosted by a Jewish community and or filled with Jewish people, which tend to be a big part of my events, I feel like that is the strongest answer that we can have. Not just to my dad, but to everyone who's trying to say, but is this okay with Judaism? Can you be like queer, LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, non-binary, transgender, whatever it is? Can you be who you are and be Jewish? The strongest answer that we can have is yes, we can talk about text, we can talk about religion. I can go into a long explanation halachically on what we can do. It doesn't matter. Because the strongest answer is the reality on the ground. The fact that right now we have 52 screens, some of them more than one person. We have dozens of people on a Sunday morning at 10:30 in the morning. I am sure that many of you have other things that you can possibly do, who are saying we want to have this conversation, not just casually as a person who happens to be trans, happens to be queer, and happens to be Jewish, but we want to have this conversation as a Jewish community. That is the strongest answer that we can have. So first and foremost, before I jump in, I'm grateful to each and every one of you for showing up. I know there's a lot of talk in the world about activism and what exactly it means. And I am personally a huge believer of small acts could mean a lot. The simple fact of any of you showing up today and saying we want to have this conversation is the strongest message to everyone in the Jewish community who might feel, for whichever reason, who people might tell them that you do not belong, you cannot be Jewish. This is the answer that yes, it's not just that you are by chance Jewish and queer. It is you are Jewish, you are queer, we are queer Jews. That is beautiful. And we'll talk more about that later. So first of all, thank you for being here. Now let's start. Hold on, I need to turn something off that keeps giving me notifications. Sorry about that. Okay, let's talk a bit about the Hasidic community. I'm going to share my screen. Sorry, it's on the last slide now, but we'll go back here. Now, as I start, I would love to hear from some of you what you know about the Hasidic community. If you want to put in the chat anything you know about the Hasidic community. There's no right or wrong answers here. I know that I assume that many of you live in the Oranges or South Orange specifically, or in that area. It's kind of hard to avoid Hasidic people altogether if you're in the New York metropolitan area. So tell me if you know anything and what you know about the Hasidic community. I do want to say a few, let's call them disclaimers. If you are someone who has studied Hasidic Judaism as in the teachings of the Hasidic masters, whatever it is, my Zaidi, as we would say, my grandfather, whether it was the Baal Shem Tov who founded the movement, or the earlier Hasidic teachings, or whatever it is, Hasidic teachings through Martin Buber or Abraham Joshua Heschel, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Hasidic culture today, not about Hasidic Judaism. And I don't know how much we'll get to that. They're two very different things. They might be related, but they're not the same. I'm also not talking about Chabad. I'm not saying that as a positive or negative thing. I'm just saying Chabad is very different than the way I grew up and than the rest of the Hasidic world in many ways, specifically culturally. So we're not talking about that. I just know that a lot of people who are not Hasidic, the Hasidic community, the one Hasidic community people tend to know a bit more, tends to be Chabad. One final thing, and that is very important. I'm not talking for everyone. I'm not saying that my experience is the exact same experience that every person who grew up Hasidic, even in Williamsburg, in Brooklyn, where I grew up, has had the same experience. It's very easy to look on a community like the Hasidic community and expect a monolith, expect a community that is black and white. I mean, they literally wear black and white clothes. So it's very easy to look and be like, oh, that community is black and white. Here's the thing, it's not. I'm talking about my own experience, but I do want to say that my family and community were not on the outskirts of the Hasidic community. We're not known as some radicals within the community. I would say in many ways, as I mentioned before, my family is very like the mainstream, or at least they sometimes set the tone of what the mainstream in the Hasidic community means. So it is by no way everyone's experience, but it is a fairly common experience for many people in these Hasidic communities. So yes, I encourage you, if any of you know anything about the Hasidic community, feel free to put it in the chat. Let me talk a bit about the contemporary origins of the Hasidic community, as in the Hasidic culture, or sometimes I would say culture, quasi-cult, whatever you want to call that, that I was raised in. So contrary to what many people believe and what many Hasidic people might want us to believe, the culture, and I'm talking specifically cultural practice as opposed to necessarily religious practice, but whatever you were looking at, clothing and language and the mentality of everyone else is evil, this attempt to create an homogeneous society, and so on, the disgust, so to speak, for the local language of wherever they are, and so on, is a relatively new concept. Mostly what happened was that after the Holocaust, for reasons that I'm not necessarily going to go into right now, they are disputed and everyone will have their own theories. I talk a bit about it in the introduction to my book. I think part of the reasons of why the Hasidic community is the way they are is partially a response to the Holocaust, and just as much, if not more, a response to the fact that after the Holocaust, the Hasidic community found themselves living in big population centers where the majority of people living around them were not Orthodox Jews. So take New York City, for example. New York City has more Jews than any city anywhere in the world at any point in recorded history. A lot of people don't realize that. New York City has more Jews than any place ever, and that is at least after the Holocaust, where the majority of Hasidic Jews in the U.S. As a whole lived in New York City, and they saw the outside world. And by outside world, I mean the non-Jewish world, and just as much the non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish world as well, as a threat. Very similar to that happened in Israel, where you see, obviously, you got the second, well, I think by now they might be the biggest, I don't know exactly how you count it, but at the time it was the second biggest Hasidic community. And once again, they were living surrounded by a majority Jewish community that was not ultra-Orthodox. So these are all factors that played a big role into the kind of culture that was created that I ultimately was raised in. The kind of mindset behind it was trying to recreate what they see as the shtetl life, the culture of the shtetls. Now, shtetl means village in Yiddish, but in this context, it's more than just a word with a meaning. It's a whole idea. It's a concept. It's not just a word. They have this hypothetical religious utopia, or in my opinion, dystopia, that supposedly existed in the, whatever you want to talk about, the Pale of Settlement, or some parts of Poland and Hungary, back in Eastern and Central Europe throughout the 18th and 19th century. They imagine a community where everyone is dressed the same, everyone speaks the exact same language, everyone is educated the same way, everyone follows the same rules and eats the same food. Anyone who studies Eastern European Jewish history knows that that never really existed, at least not in the way the Hasidic community sees it. But that is kind of what they set out to recreate. As a result, a lot of things in the community are very reactionary. They see something happening in the outside. And again, by the outside, we're not just talking about the non-Jewish world. We're talking about the non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish world as well. And they keep reacting to what is perceived as a threat. A good example of that is media. a way of really thinking of the way the Hasidic community lives in New York. And like for me, again, I'm talking about my own personal experience. Now, I'm sure the Hasidic community is not the only fundamentalist community in the United States that tells their kids and teenagers not to watch many pop culture movies or TV shows, or not to listen to music and so on. I think the part where they get quite unique is the fact that for me, as a teenager growing up in New York City, it wasn't that, like, I don't know what were the popular shows at the time. Let's take Friends as an example. It wasn't, oh, there's this TV show that I'm not allowed to listen to. The Backstreet Boys were not a choir that I was not allowed to listen to. I was unaware of their existence. And that was the case and still is for the vast majority of Hasidic kids and teenagers. It's probably also the case for many adults, but I think there are more Hasidic adults, like in the 20s and 30s, who are slightly more open to the world. That is the culture we're talking about. It's not that the outside world was forbidden. We're talking about a community that is so sheltered in their own that we were unaware of most of the things existing in the outside world. The school that I went to, we only had a general education for 5 years of an education, 4th to 8th grade, for 1 hour a day, and it was kind of a joke. By the end of it, in 8th grade, I don't think there was a single student who could speak conversational English. Don't forget, we're all living in New York City. I don't think there was any, we never even studied fractions, forget about algebra or any other advanced math. Past 8th grade, we had no general education whatsoever. In the yeshiva / boarding school, seminary, rabbinical school, whatever name you want to give it, that I went to, we had a daily study schedule of 11 hours a day. I describe it more in detail in my book, not counting prayers and meals. And these were 100% Jewish studies, and even those Jewish studies were extremely censored, what we could and could not read. On that note, I want to read another part of my book, talking about what we could or couldn't read. Just a second, I want to stop the share here. No, not what I meant. Okay.
I got you, don't worry.
Okay. I know that Jeremy really likes this text, so part of that is specifically for you, but also I think a lot of people would like it. It's on page 97 in my book, specifically talking about what we did and didn't study in school. My great uncle, this guy we call the Square Vetter, I explain who he is a bit earlier in the book. Just for those who might know, there is a village in Rockland County called New Square that some of you might have heard of. It is the most radical version of Hasidic, like the Hasidic idea of a perfect society today. Like they're talking about gender segregation, they have men and women walk on separate sides of the streets. Like if you walk into or drive into New Square, there's actual signs, one side red and one side blue, that says men's side and women's side. So that was founded by my great uncle, who was the Skver Rebbe. Skver is a village in Ukraine. He was a Twersky, part of the family that originally comes from Chernobyl. Anyway, so my grandfather lived in his house for a while. I grew up with a lot of his teaching. So one of the things he used to say, do not ask which books we cannot read. Ask which books we can read. And we're talking here about Jewish books. We're not even like, and at home, my dad wouldn't let us read anything that was in English. We had no books or magazines or anything in English. I have an aunt who lives in Milwaukee who writes a weekly column in a very popular and big ultra-Orthodox magazine. It's called Bina, in case anyone knows it. We were not even allowed to read that because it's in English. So we're talking stuff written in Yiddish and in Hebrew, even that was extremely sheltered. However, I didn't ask. I just read. First, I chose a book that wasn't actually forbidden. In fact, the yeshiva library had many copies of it, but we had been told it was only for reference only and not to be studied in depth. I'll get ready what that book was. It was the book of Joshua, the first of the biblical books of the prophets. Yes, believe it or not, we were discouraged from studying them in depth. The book of Joshua, like the whole Hebrew Bible, is considered holy scripture and the indisputable word of God, but the students were discouraged from reading too much of it. We were never given a clear explanation, only that some stories could easily be misinterpreted. I quickly learned why. I began the book and soon lost myself in the text. A few chapters in, I reached the part of the famous story where Joshua stops the sun, with God's help, of course, and the Israelites win a war against the Canaanites. They had to vanquish the enemy before the sun set and Shabbos began, so Joshua stopped the sun in the middle of the sky on a Friday until the killing was finished. It's an interesting story, and whether it's taken at face value or as legend, it shows both the love of God for his chosen people and God's supreme control over every aspect of the world. So far, nothing was alarming. Then I started reading commentaries on the story, which included the writings of a 13th century rabbi named Gershenides, whose work is controversial. While there are many canonized Jewish philosophical writings that are even considered sacred in the Hasidic community, studying them as a teenager is unacceptable, especially Gershenides. He's known as Ralbag in Hebrew, for those who are curious, whose beliefs about God, fate, and the world to come could be considered straight-up heresy. In his writing, I read for the first time about different theological approaches to God. In short, Gershenides suggested that, gasp, God isn't omniscient, an idea that goes against the central principles of our faith, the way I was raised. He also seemed to believe that miracles don't exist in our day-to-day lives. Instead, citing an idea similar to what is called in modern philosophical terms, the Watchmaker God, a God who created the world but rarely intervenes in its daily activities. As I delved into the teachings of Gershenides on Joshua, I read, there was no such miracle that the movement of the sun and moon stopped as we mentioned, because it is not true that a miracle can be introduced to nullify them as in the natural movement of the natural order of the universe. It is impossible that such a miracle can happen in the heavenly bodies. From there, he explains how besides Moses, no other person and in no other situation did God do anything out of the natural order. No miracles, no divine intervention. My brain froze. Hold on, I thought. So all these stories of miracles I've been told my whole life are what, fake? My entire life, I was led to believe that there is one Torah, one God, and one way to interpret God's word. But here's a Jewish scholar who says it's not true, and that what I've been told my entire life is wrong. My head was spinning. That's it for now. We'll let all of you hopefully read more of this. But just to give it one of many examples of like kind of how, to me, and it shouldn't be. And I think anyone who was raised, like we're talking to a conservative community, so let's just say anyone who has studied conservative theology, probably this is not surprising to you at all. And I think many people are like, yeah, sure, okay, that sounds like about a Jewish, that sounds like one of the many Jewish philosophical opinions many of us want to get behind. But for me, having been raised with not just such a censored idea of the world, but even of Judaism, this was quite surprising. Now, I want to move on and get to one specific part of both my upbringing and the Hasidic community as a whole. Let's talk about gender and gender roles in the Hasidic community. The Hasidic community is one of the most gender segregated communities in the world. I actually spent some time studying gender segregated fundamentalist communities, and I'm yet to find any community anywhere in the world that is more gender segregated. We are not just talking about a fundamentalist, patriarchal society. It goes a lot deeper than that. I want to share a video of two Hasidic weddings. Both of them are from the 90s, so I apologize in advance for the quality of the video, but I think it really brings out the message that I want to make. Both of these are my cousins, descendant of the Bobov Rebbe. For those of you, Bobov is one of the biggest Hasidic sects in the world. The person who re-implanted, they originally are from Galicia, from Poland, and the person who kind of replanted in the US was my great uncle. His name was Shlomo Halberstam. Anyway, the Bobov Rebbe. I want to share this, but I want us to focus on what we can pick up about gender roles, as well as ideas of sexuality within the Hasidic community from this specific video. I'm going to play it. When I'm done, I would love to get some feedback. So we'll take 2 or 3 people. I don't know if people can unmute themselves. Jeremy or Justin, do you know if people can unmute themselves if they want to? Huh?
They can, yeah.
They can, great. So we'll do after I show them the video, I would love to get some feedback just on the video. So we're not going to take questions the whole yet, but just any questions, comments on that video. So think about what you're picking up specifically. What are the roles of different genders, of men, women, and what you think you can learn about sexuality from that video. Sound. Okay. Now, given from the looks on many of your faces, I know that many of you have thoughts and reflections and questions specifically on this video. So again, if we're doing just questions, we'll leave that to the end, but I would love to get 2 or 3 people who feel courageous enough to unmute themselves and share some of their questions or thoughts specifically on this video. Come on, I know many of you have thoughts. I see Marlene.
Where are the women?
Sorry, what? Say that again?
Where are the women?
What is that?
Other than the bride, I saw no women.
What are women? I don't know what you're talking about.
Where are? Oh,
I got it. I got it.
oh, I get it.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you. I obviously know what. The reason I'm saying that is because it is kind of the only way I can think of answering this question. If I imagine, so let me give you, as I was leaving the community, I used to have debates with my dad about everything. And my dad is relatively, as far as Hasidic rabbis go, he's relatively open-minded, well within limits. There's certain like red lines of conversations he says he wouldn't cross, but I could have quite open conversations with him. So I remember, for example, once having a long debate with him about why Hasidic men are not allowed to wear colored shirts and how terrible colored shirts are and how wearing modern clothes both has an impact on your soul and it's also a sign of how you wear colored shirts, then your soul is colored by whatever, blah, blah, blah. I don't have to go in. I think we all get like, what are you talking about? It's a shirt. Stop it. But yes. If I would go up to my dad and be like, why can women be rabbis? I don't think he would get as worked up as me trying to tell him why Hasidic men can't wear colored shirts. He would just be like, are you out of your mind? Like, what is this even? Let me give a bit of an explanation. Of course, there are women in that video, and I want to take a few more comments, and I will explain that in a minute of what's really going on. But anything that's community-wide, specifically leadership. If you walk into a Hasidic court, or based in a rabbinical court, where they're making decisions about, I don't know, a certain new style that came out on fashion, and they're deciding if that is modest enough or not. This happens every year, literally. Every single year in Hasidic on the streets and in newspapers, there's going to be some letters from rabbis about a specific new style and fashion and how terrible that is. You're not going to find a single woman in that room. And if you walk in and you're like, where are the women? It's not even a conversation. It's not a matter of, oh, we're a patriarchal society and men are making the decisions. It's like, it's not even a question. Let's see if there's anyone else who has any questions or reflections on that video, and then we'll continue. Is there anyone else who wants to unmute themselves?
Yeah, I was
Deborah, go ahead.
curious because I've been at not that many people in a room, but I've been at some weddings where people were separate. And yeah, again, like Marlene, I'm very surprised there weren't at least a couple of females right next to her.
Well, no, not right next to her when they're dancing happening. There are women. It's 3 sides men and 1 side women.
Okay.
This video was taken by Hasidic people, so they, God forbid, wouldn't show any women. I'm joking, obviously. But yes, there are women in the room, and I will explain a bit more what's happening. But thank you for that, Debbie. I think Deborah wanted to say something. Yes, go for it.
I had just watched, and I read the book, Unorthodox. Right, and I also watched.
Did you spot me in it?
Pardon? You were in?
You find me in Unorthodox, just in the background. I was involved with it more behind the scenes, but they convinced me to be in the background in 2 episodes. Yeah.
And what you put up on the screen before, and what I saw, your marriages are arranged, and sometimes what happens if you hate the person that you meet, and you're forced to marry them? And here's this bride with all this paraphernalia all around her, and she's unhappy. And divorce is really not sanctioned.
Well, divorce is becoming more and more popular. It's still very low. It's like maybe about 10%. And like when they always talk, oh my God, arranged marriages work. Look how low our divorce rate is. I'm like, no, the arranged marriages don't work. Your divorce is just extremely stigmatized. I would say about 50% of people have loveless marriages, which is a whole separate conversation. Well, that bride, I do know who that is. She's still married. Well, she has at least 5 of her kids are already married. But yes, it is a big problem. If it's really bad, you can get divorced. But unless it's really bad, like I've never heard someone who is Hasidic get divorced because, oh, we simply didn't love each other. That never happens. If you don't love each other, you have too many babies to pay attention to that. I know it sounds messed up and sad, but that is kind of how it works. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, now I want to go ahead. We're going to run out of time soon, so I want to push ahead. But to give a bit of an explanation of what's happening. So most Hasidic weddings, for most of the time, so this part that you call the Mitsvatans that you saw where they're dancing, holding the rope, that happens at every Hasidic wedding, well, outside of Chabad, but the rest of the Hasidic world does it. Most Hasidic weddings, this happens after midnight, and usually there's only immediate family, let's say somewhere around 50 people left. This is the equivalency of a royal wedding. It's the Rebbe's grandson, so there's like a lot more people. But this happens at every Hasidic wedding. I've been to hundreds of Hasidic weddings, literally. Like my dad has 10 siblings, my mom has 8. Most of them have 10 plus kids. So just by cousins' weddings alone, I've been to hundreds of Hasidic weddings. And this is usually the case at every wedding, where it's 3 sides men and 1 side woman. But it's a lot more than that. And I like that video because it's a good example. So for most of the wedding, up to the Mitsvatans, up to this final part, men and women are in separate rooms. The men are dancing on their own, the women are dancing on their own, or like sometimes or in the same room with like a wall in between. But even then, it is okay, like if the women want to observe the men, they're allowed to do that, but the men are not allowed to observe the woman. And then comes the Mitsvatans. You saw the bride. This specific case, she is dancing with her grandfather. As I mentioned, I know who the bride is. It's a cousin. She's dancing with her mom's father. Even according to the most strict interpretation of Orthodox Jewish law, they are 100% allowed to hold hands and dance in public. Even Orthodox people who like don't touch people of the opposite gender, so to speak, someone you are biologically related to, your parents, your siblings, grandparents, grandkids, you're 100% allowed to do that. So first and foremost, this is not a matter of Jewish law. It's purely a cultural taboo, something that is culturally unacceptable. But what happens even more strong, you see the bride is barely moving. She's dancing on her wedding day with her grandfather, and she's barely moving. That is the case for, again, I said I've been to hundreds of Hasidic weddings. That is the case at every single one of them. If there's one time there's a bride who dances along, then the video is going to go viral on Hasidic WhatsApp groups, which is their version of social media, so to speak, because, oh my God, the bride was dancing along. That is kind of the culture we're talking about. But more importantly, the women are, at their own weddings, at their own things, observers. It's not just that the men are in control. The men are doing all the action, the women are observers. And that is something that is not just at weddings, not just at services, but at the vast majority of community engagements where men and women participate. Again, yes, there are leaders for women when they are just amongst themselves. They dance when they're just amongst themselves, but when they are in the same room, the men are fully in control and the women are, for all intents and purposes, in their own community, observing. They're watching. Another good example of that would be like the way it works in Hasidic communities. If a Rebbe dies, usually a son takes over. If a Rebbe dies and he has no sons, it will be, even if he has daughters, it will be a brother or a son-in-law, never a daughter. There's no such a thing as a woman becoming Rebbe, at least not today. There's some historical examples, but at least not today. That is the way we need to think about when we think about gender segregation. It's not just a patriarchal society, it is segregated to an extreme. And another good example of what you see here is sexuality. The reason why women are never allowed to dance in front of men, in this case, the bride herself, because women are sexual objects. Women are not sexual objects, but like women are perceived as sexual objects who have no sexual agency or desire, while men are not sexualized, they're not sexual objects or sexually attractive, who have extremely strong sexual desires that they cannot control, and it's a woman's responsibility to help them control that. That ends up being controlling so much of society. I want to say one final thing before I move on, though. I think it's easy for many of us to listen or to watch a video like that, or to listen to that and be like, oh my God, these people are so fundamentalist and so radical. Like, women are not sexual objects. Like, women are allowed to dance in front of men and nothing as bad is going to happen and so on. But the reality is that the Hasidic community, with their ideas of gender roles and their ideas of sexuality, they don't actually live in a bubble. I know it might be surprising to both Hasidic people and people who are not. In many ways, and that was one of the biggest shocks that I had after I left the Hasidic community, was to realize that the ideas of gender and sexuality in the Hasidic community are simply more radical versions of some of the most progressive societies. Let me give a personal example. I studied public policy in college, and I worked for quite a few years, mostly with women politicians who were either elected officials or running for office, mostly locally, local government in the New York area. Every single one of them was at some point in their lives, in their careers, asked how they balance their family life and their work. I've worked with people who are in their 60s and in their 20s, people who are married and not, have kids or not. Doesn't matter. If you don't have kids, why don't you have kids? If you have kids, why can't you do that? And why can't you work and have kids? Or rather, maybe you shouldn't work and just have kids. I can go on. All kinds of comments. Ironically, the only man I've ever worked with that I've heard ask the same question was a gay man who was married with 2 kids. I'm not saying it never happens to straight men, but I think we all know that it rarely does. It's just one of the many examples of the same mentalities of gender roles, same mentalities of sexuality that exists even in some of the most progressive societies. In the vast majority of US states, we're going to take questions at the end. The vast majority of US states, if a woman gets assaulted, and I'm not even talking about sexual assault, I'm talking about physical assault, not even sexually. She gets robbed, whatever, call it whatever you want. The defense attorney can start asking questions. What was she wearing? Maybe the perfume was too strong. Maybe she was asking for it. I will let you guess how many times that happens to men. The reason I'm bringing that up, I think it's sometimes easy for people who are raised with this kind of culture on a lower level, so to speak, in the outside world. And I feel like the Hasidic community gives us a bit of an opportunity to realize how ridiculous we all sound sometimes, consciously and subconsciously. I want to move on. If you will allow me, I want to read one other part of my book. and then I want to share some texts. Let's find it. Here we go. So I'm talking here about after I had a period when I was about 15, 16 years old that I almost left the Hasidic community. I was a total heretic. As I've mentioned before, the Christianity's text, that text led to me reading many other forbidden philosophical books. I ultimately got to a point where I thought I'm giving up. Then I met a rabbi. His name was Yitzchak Moshe Erlanger. He lives in Jerusalem, but he came to visit New York. Again, I described the whole journey of that in the book. But he suggested to me that I should get into Kabbalah, I should get into Jewish mysticism. And this is where I want to read. Rabbi Yitzchak Moshe told me to start with 2 books in particular. Both of them from the writings of Rabbi Chaim Vital, the 16th century mystic, who had written down the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Lion, the father of modern Kabbalah. One was a book called The Treasures of Life, an introduction to mysticism. The other was The Doors of Reincarnation, a study of human souls and their place in the world. The first book was helpful, even enlightening, but it didn't offer any real clarity about my own life. Then I opened the second book and began to read. It was early on a Friday morning that winter when I reached chapter 9. The chapter focuses on the gender of souls and how different souls may enter different bodies throughout time. I was sitting at my usual place at a table mounted to the eastern wall of the study hall. There were only a few other students in the study hall at that hour, and the room was quiet. In front of me was my book on my bookstand, which I'd been reading in the dim light, drinking a cup of Tasted Choice coffee as I turned the pages. In chapter 9, I read, at times, a male will reincarnate in the body of a female, and a female will be in the body of a male. The words jumping up from the page in front of me. I froze. I read it again and again and again. For the first time after 16 years, I had found a text that justified my existence. Maybe I wasn't crazy after all. I stood up from my chair, left the study hall, walking outside into the cold air, into the forest, where I cried like a baby. I want to point out, we're not going to go into that, we literally have 10 minutes left, so I want to, and then we'll take some more questions, but I want to point out some text, but I wanted to share that because to me, it's one of the many examples of the power. Sorry about that. It's one of the many examples of the power that text could have. I don't think we need religious texts to justify who we are, but I think they can be used to help us make sense of it. That text that I just shared, forget about religion for a second. It is written in the 16th century. Most of us would expect to quote like, sometimes a male will be in a female body, a female will be in a male body from a gender theory professor of the 21st, maybe the 20th century. It's not something many of us expect to find in the 16th century, let alone a religious text. Yet it's not unique. There are many examples of this. There's this Mishnah in Bikurim, which is one of the hundreds of examples where the Talmud talks about gender that goes beyond male and female. Traditional Judaism and the most traditional interpretation of that recognizes at least 6, in all likelihood 8 different genders. And we're not just talking about people's different genitals. We're talking about gender in the similar context of today, people's different roles and places in society. You got this text. Some people are like man in some ways, like a woman in some ways, like both a man and a woman, and like neither a man nor a woman. We're not even talking about transgender. We're not even talking like the quote from the Ari, from Rabbi Isaac Luria, some person with a specific gender ends up in a different body. We're talking how some people do not even, they're all over. Rabbi Meir, oh my God, he's such a radical. Some people do not even fit on the gender binary altogether. It's a different gender category. Forget for a second the religious ramifications of this text. This is written in the 2nd century. We got this example in the 13th century. Rabbi Kloinemus ben Kloinemus, a Jewish paitan, a Jewish poet. We're not talking about a minor rabbi. I like to use an example. There's a Wikipedia page about him. Not many 13th century rabbis have Wikipedia pages about them. Just to give you an example, we're not talking about a rabbi that no one has ever heard from before. And this is a poem that he wrote. What an awful fate to my mother that she bore a son. Cursed be the one who announced to my father it's a boy. Oh, but had the R's and a made me, created me instead of fair woman. Again, I don't have time to focus on these, so I'm moving ahead. Followed by a prayer, who would then turn me from a man to a woman, equating their experience to that. There's this quote, this text, which is very personal to me. The screenshot you see on the right is what I showed to my dad when I came out to him. It's an 18th century text from one of the earliest Hasidic rabbis. At times, a male would be in a female body. He's obviously building off from the Kabbalistic text from the Ari, because in the readings of Gilgal, which is the study of reincarnation. Why am I sharing that? I don't think we need these texts to justify who we are. But as you have seen from my own personal story that I shared, these texts can create something extremely powerful to show people that we're not alone. I believe that we need to move on from the discourse that we have been having, which is to tolerate, to accept, to welcome LGBTQ people. And in this case specifically, we're talking about transgender people. We need to learn to celebrate. In Judaism, the way we approach people is never, oh, you're okay, well, fine, you are who you are. Oh, a baby was born, okay, great. We're like, a baby is born, great, we're going to throw a party now. Whether it's a kiddush or a bris, you're getting married, amazing. Let's throw you some parties. Our approach is to celebrate people. And what we need to learn is to celebrate people not in spite of who we are, but because of who we are. I want to show one final video, and then we'll take some questions. I'm sorry if we're going a bit over time. I apologize, but I want to get to that point. Now, I assume that some of you, and you can show by a show of hand, I see some of you had a bar mitzvah, you know, what boys usually have. How many of you had a bar mitzvah? Show of hands, some of you. I see some of you there. How many of you had a bat mitzvah? You know, the girls usually do. Okay. How many super Jews do we have in the room? By that, I mean, how many of you had both? I can't see everyone, but I think that's just me. Well, I win. I want to show the video of that, because to me that is just, I'm not telling all of you what to do exactly, but it's one of the many examples where we can show that it's not just okay. It's like what I started with. There is, that's where these texts come is so helpful, because Judaism has a long tradition of not just accepting, not tolerating, but celebrating. We'll show this video and then we'll take questions.
In our tradition, leaving Egypt wasn't an historical event alone. In our tradition, leaving Egypt was a personal, existential leaving as well. Whenever we leave a narrow place, a place of constriction, painful servitude, a place where we are not authentically who we are, that leave-taking, that transitioning is an exodus. It's a freedom walk. And so at this moment, we have risen, we have stood now in order to be in community with our very dear, dear, dear friend and member and teacher, who will make a blessing of transition and walk slowly through this space, this narrow space, to a place of Torah, to a place of reception, and to a place of new name. We turn to face.
Amen.
Amen. Ufros chavivi olai et sukan shlomecha yigalena ufros chavivi olai et sukan shlomecha. Mishaberach Avotenu Vimotenu, and one who blessed our ancestors. Bless this morning one who has come forward to receive a new name in our tradition, to be known by Israel, to be known amongst this community and all communities as Avigail Chava bat Menachem Mendel v'Chaya Shendel. Avigail Chava. May the merit of all of those who have walked from a narrow place into an expansive place be with you. May the signature of the one who is known as Emet, the one who is known as truth, be with you as you have now embraced, first to yourself and now in Kahal Rav, amongst those who love you and know you. Embrace the truth of who you are and the joy of who you are. Avigail.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'etzani b'tzalmo.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'echianu v'kiyimanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh.
Amen. Oh, Simane, Simane Tov. Oh, Mazal Tov. Oh, Yehelanu Lekol Yisrael.
Oh, I did want to share one other thing. Just a second. I want to take some questions. I wish we had more time to focus on everything we shared, but I know we're kind of out of time, but I want to have time to take some questions. If anyone want to find me online, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, a link to order the book if you want, a website. Jeremy, I don't know how we want to do questions, if you want to moderate it, if you have some questions on how we want to do it, but let's get to some.
Okay, first, thank you so much, Abby. That was really wonderful. And just rich and barely scratches the surface, but it was just such a rich, wonderful presentation. I wanted to just start out with a question that I had, and then if you could put your questions in the chat box and then either unmute yourself or I will just read them out. Okay, the first question.
I just want to say, I would encourage people to unmute themselves. I love to engage with you all.
Okay, so then express your interest in the chat box, and then I'll call on you to unmute yourself. How's that? So that we don't have to just arise.
Thank you.
I read a recent anthropological book called Hidden Heretics: Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age by Ayala Feder.
Yeah.
And she writes that for those who, it's a new book, but she writes that there are hundreds of Hasidic and other Haredi Jews in North America, maybe even in Israel, who digitally are heretics. They express their doubts anonymously or pseudonymously in various websites, but they continue to live overtly ultra-Orthodox lives, I guess, because of the ties to their wives, their kids, their community, their jobs. So my question to you is, did you ever think of this as an option? And if not, why not?
Well, I did very much. I was part of such a community. I was personally part of a Facebook group. It was named at the time Reverse Moranos. You know, the Moranos from Spain, but this is like, they called them they called themselves a reverse version of that. That group alone had hundreds of people in it. And these were just people who could speak Yiddish. So like that group is kind of like ended up being mostly people who could speak Yiddish. So like we're talking hundreds of Yiddish speaking ultra-Orthodox Jews. I assume there's thousands around the world. And yes, there's also a big community of that in Israel. They used to have a forum on a website called Tapuz, which means orange in Hebrew. But there used to be a forum there called Charedim Bal Korcham, which means ultra-Orthodox by force, or like forced to be ultra-Orthodox. I was part of that community. To me, it was always felt like a stepping stone. The only time when I would consider doing that was when I was still married, and I was thinking if that could like keep me married and keep me living with my son full time, it would have been worth it. Ultimately, my ex's family stepped in, kind of kidnapped my ex, and like it's a long story that we'll talk about in the second book. And once I realized that wasn't an option anymore, it wasn't even up to me, I just saw no reason to stay anymore. Like once they like pretty much took away my ex and my son, it was just like, what's the point? And as you mentioned, a lot of people who do that is because of family, jobs. You'd be surprised. I actually had friends who were like that for 15 years, and they were a couple. So like, obviously it wasn't their wives or their kids. It was more like the jobs and other things. And they just left literally. They had their oldest daughter came out as queer. And kind of when she was 18, and kind of like that pushed them to leave. So they literally left last year. Point being, yes, I know many people in that community. It's very interesting. They have different names. I think the academic term is called orthoprax, which is like Orthodox practicing as opposed to believing in some ways. But yeah, it's a longer conversation. And it is, a Yellow Feather does some great research. I sometimes think it's a bit too academic, and I personally prefer a bit more of the humanity in it, but obviously we need that as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Marlene, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
So I just felt so much joy when I saw the synagogue service now where you were named. How did you find, first of all, for the average Jew, it's difficult to find a synagogue, hopefully one where you live close, close to where you live.
Yeah.
To belong and feel warmth and love and all the things you want from a congregation. How did you find that?
Well, first, let's start by saying it's one of the things I love living in New York and the Judaism in New York City. I know a lot of people, maybe specifically some Israeli Jews, might take a lot of issue with that, but sorry, not sorry. I like American Judaism a lot better than Israeli Judaism, specifically for the fact of the diversity we have within Judaism. In Israel, there's this joke that Chilonim, secular Israelis, the synagogue they don't go to is an Orthodox synagogue. As in even people like who are not religious, their ideas of Judaism still tend to be Orthodox. And I think there's many, I don't want to say many issues. I'm not into kiruv. I'm not into getting people to be more or less religious. But I think there's a lot missing from the richness that we have in the US. And I know people around the world just love to complain how terrible American Judaism is. So here's me saying that I really love it. And I think specifically in a place like New York, on the Upper West Side alone, I call it, we have a buffet of synagogues that I think everyone could find. You've got everything, obviously, from traditional, like Orthodox, there's Hasidic synagogues on the Upper West Side. You've got ultra-Orthodox, you've got numerous modern Orthodox, you've got progressive Orthodox, egalitarian, you've got many conservative, many reform, Reconstructionists. You have got places like BJ B'nai Jeshurun, who are kind of conservative, but kind of doing their own thing, and so on. So I think I will say that if you were really looking for a community you can't find, New York might be a good place to explore and find places. Ultimately, the synagogue that I ended up going to was a Roman one. It's a synagogue I'm still a member of. I do a lot of stuff with them. I teach a lot there. I give sermons and read from. I don't work for them. I'm just a member, but I do a lot of amazing stuff with them. So the rabbi at Roman one, the founder, was Rabbi David Ingber. He's mentioned in the book for anyone who will read it. He grew up Orthodox himself, was ultra-Orthodox for a while, then left everything. It's a long story. It's not my story to tell necessarily, but he was really supportive and helpful to me, I would say, both as a friend and as a mentor since 2014. So when I left the Hasidic community in 2012 for about 2 years, I didn't want to have anything to do with any Jewish community. Rabbi David actually calls that post-God traumatic disorder. I don't know if it's a legitimate disorder, but it's a real thing when you grow up where like God is that what I call the boogeyman in the sky, just the way I grew up. The person, the creature who's going to put you to hell if you flip a light switch on Friday night. And like, it's very like ominous, which is kind of weird because original Hasidic teachings don't believe in that God. It's like ironic that many early Hasidic masters would be considered atheists by many Hasidic Jews today. Not going to go into that long story. So I was introduced first to call it progressive, modern, liberal, whatever name you want to give it, Judaism. The first book I read was Judaism as a Civilization from Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. It's a fascinating book. I attempted reconstructionist Judaism for a while, and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't really for me. I do want to say that, similar to the idea that I mentioned the buffet, I have had the privilege to work with and for every Jewish denomination. I have taught at Conservative and Reform and Renewal and Reconstructionist Hebrew schools. I worked at Ramah. I worked at Eden Village. I've done events with literally every Jewish denomination, numerous events and so on. And I really think that every Jewish community has some beautiful and unique features. So what I'm saying is not for me. I found the community that works for me best. I'm not here to rate which Judaism is best. I think we all, and I really believe in that. I really enjoy each different denomination and each different synagogue on their own merits, and it's really beautiful. But for me, Reconstruction is that at least the ones that I checked out didn't feel like my home. And then a friend introduced me to Romemu. And I will say the first time, Romemu was the community that was founded by Rabbi David Ingber. They fall under the umbrella of what they call Jewish renewal, albeit I will say it's a really loose umbrella. You have in the same synagogue people who don't use their phones on Shabbat and keep 100% kosher according to Orthodox standards, and people who eat bacon for breakfast every day. And these people are part of the same community. I personally find this beautiful. We have a range of practices, a range of backgrounds, and it's a really beautiful community that is also one of the most progressive communities, not just Jewish communities, one of the most progressive communities, period. One of the things that drew me to it, and it was even before I came out, was the fact that it's egalitarian to an extreme. Like your gender, your sexuality has no negative impact on your place in the community in any way or form. So they also have something, they're part of a bigger movement, what people call neo-Hasidic, which are communities and people who take different ideas of Hasidic Judaism without a lot of the baggage. You will have people from like Karl Bach, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and many other would probably fall under that umbrella. So for me, it has a lot of the things that I like, that I grew up with, a lot of Hasidic flavor without the baggage. And it has a lot of progressive values, a lot of showing up for social justice, for racial justice, and so on. So it goes beyond just serving the religious needs that I have. But I will say, I still go synagogue hopping every now and then. I really enjoy it. I really love it. Yeah.
Abby, there's a number of questions that all go around the same issue, and so I'm going to just, as moderator, combine them because they're all like one, and it has to do with, well, basically your family. How did your mother react? You talked about your father's reaction. How about your mother's reaction? And then what is your current relationship with your parents, your son, and your siblings? So that gets two parts. What was your mother's reaction, and what's your current relation with your son, parents, siblings? Okay.
So unfortunately, I never got to come out to my mother. When I originally called my dad and I told him I wanted to come out, I told him I want to talk to both of you, and he said no. And then after I came out to him, I told him I want to talk to mommy, and he said no. I know it sounds crazy to many of you. I like, just talk to her anyway, but I can't. If he says no, she agrees to that. I need to charge my computer. Give me a second. I'm talking around about it. Sorry about that. Better. Okay. It's weird and messed up that he gets to kind of control that, but I never actually got to speak to my mom about it. And like I tried calling her, but she wouldn't pick up, and she doesn't even have text messages. So my dad doesn't have internet, but at least has text messages. My mom doesn't even have that. So after I came out and my dad told me he's never going to speak to me again, I did continue texting him, or calling and texting, but he never picked up. I text for the first year. I would say I texted him every year. After that, I started texting him only once, the kind of like usually during holidays. And I will say for over 5 years, my dad stood by his "I'm never talking to you again." However, a few weeks ago, so the day before Pesach, on Friday, For the first time in like 5.5 years, my parents actually did I called and they picked up. We had a very brief conversation. It was kind of weird and felt a bit scripted, but I think it went well relatively. So I think there's a hopefully change in the future. I prefer not to talk about my son in public much. I will say, yeah, well, originally after divorce, we got a 50-50 joint custody agreement, but the rest of his life, I like to keep private. I will say one final thing in terms of family. So I have a good relationship with, well, one brother I'm really close with. I have one other sister who responds to my text, so to speak. As I would say, like 2 siblings who I have a relationship with, and about like 10 or 15 or so of my first cousins. Some of them a really close relationship. I like to focus on the positive. So yes, I focus on the 10 siblings and hundreds of cousins who don't speak to me, or I could focus on the 2 siblings and the 10 cousins who do speak to me. And most people my age that I know only have 2 siblings and 10 cousins. That's a big family. So I focus on the positive, and focus on the family that I do have, and to work on these relationships and so on. Do we have? I think I can take 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay. Here's a different one. Or maybe Stuart, could you unmute and give that one directly, since it's not a portmanteau? It's about.
Sure.
Okay.
Rabbi Abby, I'm just curious. I know that you are. I've been, following you on Facebook, since you were at OHEB and since you came out, and I know how engaged you are in the Jewish community. You've shown that here, and I also know that you are, let's say, a God wrestler. Somebody who questions the existence, or if there is a higher being, we don't know what the nature of that being is. And I know that a lot of us are that way. So can you give us some insight into how you can, balance those two, remain so involved in the Jewish community as many of us want to, while having those doubts?
Well, thank you so much for bringing that up. And yes, I know a lot of people don't like to talk about it, but you're right. A lot of people do have these wrestling, and it's true. Like the name for the Hebrew name for the Jews, like Yisrael, literally means God wrestler, wrestling with God. So here's the thing I would say. If you're talking about people ask me a lot, do you believe in God? I had someone ask me, and my direct response to that always is, I want you to define to me what does believe mean and what does God mean, and then I will think about answering your question. But I had once at an event, someone told me, no, this is a yes or no question. Do you believe in God? Yes or no? My response was, if God to you is yes or no, then the answer is no. And I will say, if you think about the academic idea of what many people call the Abrahamic God, I hate that term. I think the ideas of God and even the Abrahamic religions are very different. Well, even within Judaism, there's numerous different ideas of God. Like, as I read before, between Maimonides and Gershonides, they would call each other heretics. And they're both considered Jewish scholars and sages, and they're both published in the traditional canon of like if you look on a traditional Nevi'im, both of their commentaries are in there, and they literally called each other heretics in their writings. So obviously, there's numerous ideas of God. But if you're thinking about the traditional God, what I call the creature in the sky, the boogeyman in the sky, whatever you want to do that. If that's your God, I'm an atheist. I'm proud of it. I think there's some positive ideas of you, positive things that we can get from that idea. However, if we want to have a conversation about where I think how God has been a term that many people throughout history, many cultures have used to relate to something beyond ourselves. Personally, the idea that I relate to most is, some of you might have heard Rabbi Art Green. If you've never heard of him, look him up. He is the founder and dean of the Hebrew College Rabbinical School in Boston. He wrote many books. One of his favorite books for me is a very philosophical book. It's sometimes hard to read, but it's really good. It's academic as well, called Radical Judaism. So he explains how one of the interpretations of the Hebrew name for God, specifically the 4-letter, like Yid Hey Vav Hey, one of the interpretations of that traditionally is that it means being. It means, imagine being with a capital B, the sum total of existence. To me, when I think the version of God, or what many people use God that I relate to, I prefer using the term relate to as opposed to believe in, is this concept of a word that we use to talk about the sum total of existence, the sum total of all there is. There's an old Hasidic saying that says that God is everything and God is nothing. In many ways, academic philosophy, that is atheism. It's a belief that as opposed to God being what is called a duality, being God and humanity or good and evil, they see it, and it sounds very modern, but in reality, already Kabbalistic and more so in Hasidic teachings, they talk a lot about it, how everything in the world is God. A lot of people know this idea that everything has a spark of God. And that is a Hasidic idea popularized by Chabad, so a lot of people tend to know that more. But the other Hasidic school says that everything is God. This cup doesn't have a spark of God. It is God. You and I don't have sparks of God. We are God. So in a more like down-to-earth form, what that really means is that when we say the word God, we are referring to the sum total of existence. It's a way of relating to what brings us together. Think scientifically for a second. The fact is that if you start breaking down the universe, you're going to get to atoms. Ultimately, we are all, it's not some metaphorical, hypothetical, spiritual stuff. The reality is that we are all the exact same when you break it down. Not just humans, we're talking humans and literally all there is. And instead of every time we want to say that, what I just explained, we give you a whole sermon, I think many people throughout history used words like God, or Yud He Vaveh, or El, or Adonai, or dare I say, Jesus, or Buddha. Well, the Hindus have thousands of words to relate to something like that. That is kind of, and so to me, it doesn't just not get in the way. I will say frankly, I don't see the Bible as, oh, there's a boogeyman in the sky who wants you to do X, Y, and Z, otherwise he's going to get really angry, which is kind of like what a lot of people call the Old Testament God. I merely see it as a book written by people trying to understand how we get closer to that, how we make, when I think about Tikkun Olam, making the world a better place, it's not just, oh, it's the morally correct thing to do. It is ultimately how, and I have a whole source sheet on that, maybe one time. There's a lot of texts, both Hasidic and others, that kind of point to that idea. We want to make the world a better place because if every human being, and not just human being, if the animals in nature, if everything is God, when we think of the term Tikkun Olam comes from the prayer of Al Kena Kavalecha, the second part of Aleinu. It says L'taken Olam b'malchut Shaddai, to fix the world in the kingdom of, well, to use the very Christian kingdom of God. But if we think about it in that way, simply what it means that we want to make every person whole, because that's how God, in whichever way we look at it, becomes whole. I hope that helps a bit. We can literally talk about that for days. And I've done a lot of work in that. I have a lot of source sheets. Remind me later, if you get in touch with me on social media, I can send you some of these source sheets. But yeah, that is kind of the basics of it. And I will say, like, ultimately, yes, I can identify as an atheist and be very proud of it, because I think there's messages that go with it where we are going to reject this boogeyman in the sky idea. And I think that is very powerful. And at the same time, there is many ideas, many words of being, of Adonai, of God, that I very much relate to and that I very much want to lean into that. And that is what we work with. Okay, I think I can take one more question.
Okay, Roberta, do you want to unmute and give your question?
Sure. You described the typical early education in the community that you grew up in. And obviously you're a very articulate and literate person. And my curiosity is, how did you bridge the gap?
Well, let me tell you a secret. I still feel sometimes that I haven't bridged it fully. I feel like I know enough to pretend that I know everything about like culture as a whole. But you're all right. It was a very big struggle. I would say not just obviously the language. I couldn't speak English. I couldn't read English until I was like 2021. I spent a lot of time studying. Pardon my language, but I worked my ass off. Or as we would say in Yiddish, I worked my tuchas off. I worked really hard kind of trying to make up for that. I used to joke when I was already at school, I joked that if I worked as hard at college as hard as I worked to get into college, I would definitely be the valedictorian. But I think we all, after a while, like when you've made up some of it. Ultimately, I don't know what to say other than it was really hard. It took a lot of studying, a lot of reading, a lot of listening, trying many different programs. I had a lot of help and support. Specifically, I would name Footsteps, which I assume some of you have heard. If you haven't looked them up, their website is footstepsorg.org for anyone to look them up. There's a documentary on Netflix called One of Us that covers a bit of them. Footsteps is a nonprofit organization, a Jewish nonprofit based in New York that supports people who are leaving the ultra-Orthodox community. They don't try to get people to leave, but they're supporting people who are leaving. So I got a lot of educational support, both through they have a scholarship fund, which makes up a big part of their budget, that helps hundreds of people who grew up in the ultra-Orthodox community go to college. I got many tutors from them. I learned some of the basics about fashion and about culture from them. They did amazing work. And ultimately, in many ways, it's a lifelong journey. It's not something you do, you leave, you transition, and you're good to go. It is a lifelong journey, and I am really grateful to the people, the communities, organizations that brought me here, so to speak. I think I am,
Thank you so much. Yes, that's a perfect ending. Thank you so much for giving us this wonderful presentation, this extra time. And it's very heartwarming for all those who remember you from when you were the Hebrew school teacher here, and we give you a virtual hug across the things. And there's other questions, so everyone, you can Abby, if you can leave behind something so people can follow you on whatever social forums.
So on Facebook, just look up Abby Stein. You will find I have an official page with a check mark. You can't miss it. But on Twitter and Instagram, I am this. So hopefully we can, get in touch through that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all taking of this Sunday morning to participate and attend and learn with our rabbi here. So thank you very much, Abby, and that's it.
Thank you all. Okay. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.